All right, so hello. Welcome to this presentation on machine learning. For those of you who don't know me very well, my name is Eric Zachariah, and I'm a graduate student here at the University of Chicago. And my goal for this presentation today is to inform you about what machine learning is, why it's not as complicated as it sounds, and how it might be used to assist with your own research. So here's a summary of what I'll cover in this presentation. First, I'll explain what machine learning is all about. Next, I'll show you a few examples of projects and go into detail about how they work. Then I'll dive deeper into the process of making predictions using precompiled information. And finally, we'll review the drift compensation project that Haihui and I have been working on this summer. All right, so what is machine learning? In simple terms, machine learning is the use of computers to make predictions from data. You might not directly see how this applies to some really popular projects, such as working with robots and self-driving cars. But at the root of all of their decisions, a computer is crunching hundreds of thousands of numbers per second to calculate probabilities of various outcomes, from which it then makes an intelligent decision. The word intelligent that I mentioned here is in the computer program's ability to make decisions without human intervention using probability and statistics, as well as linear algebra and sometimes in more recent years, calculus. So first we'll talk about supervised machine learning, which is the umbrella term that governs the process of using pre-labeled data and probability to make predictions on unclassified data. So for example, a homeowner wants to sell their home, but they're not sure how to price it. And getting this price right the first time is really pertinent to the success of the home sale for getting the most money possible. In this figure here, we have a spreadsheet showing 5 similar homes that sold recently in the area. And the homeowner wants to make a decision to price their home based on these recent home sales. This table is referred to as labeled data because the outcome column to be predicted is the price of the home. And we have historical sale information. And because we know what that outcome price was, this is referred to as labeled data. Now, based on the recently sold homes in the area, a human person would be able to look at this table and start to notice how each of the different features of the homes have affected their selling price. You might make an educated guess for the price of the home at the bottom, but you're making a really big decision here, and your sample size is pretty small, meaning you've only considered 5 homes. So who's to say that these 5 homes all sold for a fair amount? Perhaps the home with the 4 bathrooms sold for a little bit too much. So it'd be better if we considered many more homes to decrease the weight of any outliers in our data. So I created this analysis to get a good idea for a price to sell my own home before speaking to a real estate agent, because I'm in the middle of moving to Chicago. And I created a data set of 50 recently sold homes in my area. And after looking at the 50 homes, I could kind of start to see how features like the number of beds and baths affected the home price. But the data set was too large for me to make a good guess with all the variables involved. You can kind of see patterns, but it's hard to be accurate. So instead of guessing, I created a linear regression machine learning model, which essentially takes all of the rows and columns of data, and it makes a prediction for the price that my home would sell for without sitting on the market for too long. This linear regression model works similar in the way that we humans look at the smaller table of 5 homes to make a prediction. It considers each of the features from each of the homes, and it weighs the importance of each feature on how they affect the resulting sale price. The major difference here is that the computer is not estimating or forgetting any of the information it has already seen. It is able to consider much more information than any human by committing it to memory and it is able to weigh the importance of each of the features by performing hundreds of thousands of computations per second. Now, another example of using labeled data is this project I did for my natural language processing class that I took this summer, for which I created a bot that analyzes the sentiment of tweets from Twitter about stocks, and then it trades shares for those stocks on a stock exchange. So natural language processing, if you don't know what that is, it's a subcategory of machine learning that allows computers to process human language into vectors of numbers for the purpose of making predictions regarding a piece of text. And in this case, I was focused on analyzing the sentiment of text. And then that is the text from a tweet is classified as either bullish or bearish, which are terms used for projecting how well a stock is going to perform. Here I used supervised machine learning model because I had a precompiled data set of tweets about stocks and their corresponding sentiment, which I used to train and then test my model. This clip here is a time lapse of the bot trading from market open on a Monday morning for about 5 hours. And as you watch, you start to see the bot making money, but it's difficult to say whether it actually performed really well or if it was just a good trading day for everyone trading in the market that day. But what was really interesting to observe is that the bot's intelligence is coming purely from the sentiment of tweets, because it actually has no idea how well a stock is performing when it decides to trade it. It doesn't get any input about its trending price or any other kind of financial data. It was only making decisions based on the live opinions from people on Twitter. And that was made possible with the help of, honestly, just a couple of years ago, state-of-the-art machine learning models that just arose. And now we can talk about how this model works. This is a high-level overview of how the bot functions. It begins with cleaning and pre-processing the data set of tweets and their labeled sentiment. This is a really easy and important step that starts off any machine learning project that you may do in the future. For example, I wanted my labeled column to be zeros and ones instead of the words bullish and bearish, because that made the data set easier to work with. Also, this data is usually kept in a CSV file, which is a type of Excel file that delimits or separates columns of information with commas. Next, the data is then split into training and testing sets. Those are siphoned through the machine learning model, which is evaluated for performance in predicting the test data's sentiment. Model and its predictions are then saved into files so I can reuse them without having to retrain my model, which can be a really lengthy process. The queries are made to the Twitter API to pull live tweets relating to stocks, and the model makes a prediction for the sentiment of each tweet. And then bullish tweets tally up to trigger a purchase of a stock in a way, and bearish tweets tally up in a way to trigger a sell using the stock trading API that I was using. And now we can talk a little bit about unsupervised machine learning. Unsupervised machine learning is making sense from unlabeled data. And unfortunately, I don't have any experience in this area beyond briefly learning about it in the classroom. But I've done some reading on it. And the reason that unsupervised learning exists is because sometimes getting access to labeled data is really difficult or impossible. Acquiring labeled data might require manual labor, such as compiling, reading, and labeling, say, 5,000 tweets as bullish or bearish, or perhaps a census going door to door for a survey. This obviously takes time, and sometimes people just want to make sense out of some enormous mass of unorganized information. And so while this data that's unlabeled may appear to humans as an unorganized mess of information, various algorithms and models have been developed by humans to allow for computers to make sense of such information and cluster the data points from the mess into groups of data closely related to each other for classification purposes. such as identifying harmful contaminants in drinking water. One popular method of doing so is called principal component analysis. So one really great thing about machine learning is that everyone with a computer has free access to open source code that allows them to create fairly decent models without needing to be an expert in this list of math subjects here. But knowing these subjects will definitely give you the tools to increase the overall prediction accuracies of your models. Just understanding the background calculations that happen is really helpful. You do, however, need to know how to read and write code. And Python is currently the most popular programming language for this type of work. I also listed on the slide some of those popular open source machine learning libraries that I mentioned. These are the free ones you find on the web, and they have documentation for how to use them. And finally, no, not finally. Okay, so machine learning is all about making predictions and decisions. And a good machine learning model will make its prediction based on the general trend of the data. The opposite of this generalized decision-making is called overfitting, which means that the model is simply memorizing the data and telling you what it has already seen. And this is really bad in a way, and I'll show you here. Here's an illustration of what I mean by overfitting the data. In this figure, we have plotted our training data as well as our machine learning model's prediction curve in 2 dimensions. And at first glance, you might say, hey, this is a really good fit. The model predicts the training data almost perfectly. But then we bring in the remaining portion of the data to test the model, and we calculate the total error of the prediction for the test data. And we find that our model didn't do so well, and the error was relatively high. So what happened here? Our model is really good at memorizing the training data, but not so good at generalizing its predictions for data it has not yet seen. And this is what we call overfitting the data. So instead, we could try fitting a really simple linear fit curve to the training data and then calculate the model's error in predicting the test data. This linear fit is about as general as we can get. And then when we look at the total error that we got when we used a more complicated polynomial curve that definitely overfits the data, and compare it to the total error for the linear fit curve that probably underfit the data a little bit, after a quick visual inspection, we can infer that the linear fit has less error and therefore is more accurate with predictions. And by less error, I just mean those error bars are actually shorter if you were to line them all up with each other. Now, this is not to say at all that linear fitting is always better than a polynomial fitting. The slide simply illustrates the idea that there exists some happy medium between a higher order polynomial curve and a simple line. So now you might be wondering about the former example with housing prices that had more than 2 feature columns of data, which correspond to a plot's dimensions, or axes, as you might call them when you plot it. If you were to plot home prices based on their square footage, you would notice how the price increases as the square footage increases. You could also probably draw a straight line representing an approximate line of best fit through the data points. The equation for that line is 2-dimensional because it considers only 2 features, in this case, the price and the square footage. With enough artistic ability or some 3-dimensional computer graphing software, you might be able to graph this line, or in that case, it would be a plane of best fit with another feature, such as the number of bedrooms. But what happens if we want to include yet another feature, or perhaps hundreds of features? We can no longer picture this idea of a higher dimensional line of best fit, but thanks to linear algebra, we can solve a system of linear equations to come up with an equation for this multi-dimensional line. The lower figure illustrates this type of transformation from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. And the same idea applies to models with more than 3 dimensions, but we can't really draw it. And then finally, we'll discuss a little bit about the summer project that I've been working on. The goal of this project is to use machine learning techniques to compensate for sensor drift. This figure here shows one example run of the model's prediction, shown as the green line. The sensor appears to be drifting in its voltage measurement over a period of time at a constant temperature, shown as the red line. And so in this run, the model was able to compensate the voltage with 99.8% accuracy when the temperature was 30 degrees, but only 78% accuracy when the temperature was 45 degrees. So clearly there's some fine tuning still needed to increase the accuracy prediction for all scenarios, such as the various temperatures. And so how does this all work? It per usual starts with some data pre-processing, as explained in the examples. So sometimes you need to work with data that needs a little bit of cleaning up and organization before you can do anything with it. Typically, you want a title in the first row, and every value in the column below the column title should be of the same type. And by type, I mean strings of characters or words or numerical values. So here we have a text file that contains lab data from a sensor with voltage readings at constant temperatures. And every so often there appears a row indicating a new experiment has begun with a different temperature. You could manually go through this text file and separate each experimental run into their own individual text files and then read those in. But this would take a very long time, and you would have to do it again if you collected more data with another experiment. And our goal is to, automate this process of cleaning and organizing data, so not to waste time in the future doing this manual clicking, which does take some programming knowledge. This is another example of data that actually came in a CSV file this time, but again, there is some discontinuation of the numerical type here in the columns of data, which indicate, in this case, a change that happened in the experiment. So some data cleaning is necessary to remove these lines and then make a note of these mid-experiment changes. And so you can kind of delete those points because you can't graph words on a numerical plot, but you can extract the information that it's saying there. So after writing some code to automate the data cleaning, we are now interested in applying the machine learning techniques used to compensate the sensor drift. For this project, we decided to use Bayesian inference, which comes from probability and statistics theory. And this decision was inspired by another article found in the Microelectronics Journal, referenced at the bottom of the slide there. So lucky for us, there's a open source Python library called PyMC3, which performs Bayesian inference with random sampling from well-known probability distributions. The prerequisites for using this library include knowing Python, and then at least some probability and statistics would be helpful. But this library reduces the need for you to be an expert on those topics, saving you probably multiple months of study in those areas. The way it works is it references the data that already exists, namely in one case, the drifting voltage readings, and then it attempts to replicate that same curve in a similar way using random sampling from probability distributions. The various fitting equations are used to mimic the curve of sensor drift, and random sampling values from the bell-shaped normal distribution equate to a random selection of parameters that are within 2 standard deviations of the mean 95% of the time. And what this means, in layman's terms, is that the replication of the curve will be similar but not equal. The randomly sampled replication of the curve is then subtracted from the original curve and added to the initial measurement of the original curve. So this process of randomly sampling data points can take some time, especially as we increase our sample size to get the most accurate prediction possible. The runtime for the random sampling process on my computer took nearly 2 days to complete initially. So a speed up in runtime was necessary because I would alter some of the fitting parameters and compare the differences in compensation accuracy between the runs. So waiting 2 days between the runs was not a very viable option. And so this called for alternative hardware with greater computation speeds. So I'd found a way to run the program using a random sampling of 200,000 samples like the other researchers did in their paper, but with a runtime of approximately 30 minutes instead of how it originally took 2 days on my local computer. And this was done using Google Colab, which is it's like an online thing that many data scientists use for machine learning models that are really, really big. And this runs the program remotely on a Google computer's GPU. And so our local computers, they run the program on a CPU. And a GPU is essentially multiple CPUs running in parallel with each other in a way. And so you might say like, hey, my laptop, it has a GPU. Why do we need to use Google's computer? And to answer that, our computers, they do have a GPU, but it's reserved for handling the visual display of the graphics on our computers. While Google has created these special computers with somewhat altered GPUs that are reserved for crunching a lot of numbers really quickly, specifically for this kind of purpose. And yeah, and that's about all without going too far into the details of the different data sets I've been working in. That's about all we've been able to accomplish this summer. So there's plenty of room for improvement right now with fine-tuning the parameters, with getting the accuracies to be closer to 100% for all the different temperatures, for example, and working with the different data sets that have different things on their axes for the plot, such as pH and voltage and time. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. This is very helpful. I like the way you structured this presentation with examples. You know, I liked the stock exchange example and the real estate example. Very useful if any of you would like to buy a house or sell a house, or you know, play with some stocks. You know, this is a motivation for learning machine learning, hopefully. Let's see if there are questions or comments for Eric.